My name is Rebecca Rose White, but everyone calls me Becky except for my dad. I'm 30 years old and I was born a little outside of Omaha, Nebraska, but my birth record says Omaha. I was there only until like 2 or 3 months of age, and then we moved away. So my mom is from South Korea, and my dad is from the United States. So my parents met in Korea when my dad was there for military. And then they got married in Korea, and then they moved to the US, and I was born pretty shortly after. So due to my dad's work, we were moving around a lot. My dad's work was very specialized, and so we didn't live in typical areas where there were a lot of other military kids around. So we didn't meet a lot of mixed Korean kids or mixed Korean families. So I didn't really have anyone to relate my experience to. But we grew up having a Korean mom who was very much like a dragon, which is funny because that's her zodiac sign. And also my dad, who is very cerebral, very academic. So while we had this one spectrum of very verbal and just very academic intelligence, over here, we had my mom who was really scrappy and streetwise and lots of common sense. As you can imagine, those two mindsets or understandings of the world clashed quite a lot. And I and my two sisters were very often caught in the middle of that. We were all very loving. Everyone loved each other, of course. But in a way, we suffered, I guess, I don't want to say abuse, but we bore the brunt of my parents' inability to relate and connect with each other. And then the trauma that my mom carried her whole life. So those were actually big factors for why I eventually came to Korea, to learn more about my mom and myself, learn Korean language so that I could better understand what happened. I was extremely independent. This is important to remember. So I didn't strongly relate to anything. I didn't really strongly relate to myself as American or white or Korean. I was just so firmly me that I could flit in and out of anything I wanted to, any situation, any society, any groups. In a way, that was my strength and also my loneliness. But when I first started realizing, oh, people do look at us differently. Oh, my mom cooks different food. I feel like you can either fight back against that and say, why? I don't want to be this, and hate that part of you. Or you could really dive into it and be more interested in it. Or in my case, it was like, well, this is my reality, so I don't see what's strange about it. I think the thing that bothered me most wasn't really white kids, not really getting things or making racist comments or just pointing out how different we were. I think what bothered me most was my Korean friends who would point that out. That, I think, affected me more because I knew that was a side of me that was almost hidden, or I didn't have the advantage or benefit to learn that because my mom didn't want us to not be American enough to not succeed. And she would tell us, you have to be better than everyone else because your white family will look down on you. And she would tell that when we were young. But when my Korean friends would say things like, you're so American, that would hurt me more, I think, than white people saying anything. So the school where I first met these Korean kids, and we weren't all friends, let's just say. But we stuck together because everyone else was white. And they were the only Asians, and I was the only other semi-Asian, I guess. Like I said before, I just kind of fit here, fit there, and I decided I'm going to fit here. And so I just kind of joined the group. I do think that was my first realizations when they would speak to Korean with each other at the table, and I couldn't connect or understand or follow along. And some of them, there was one girl in particular she would point that out or make fun of me. or say things to me specifically in Korean, knowing that I wouldn't understand what she was talking about. And that was really difficult to acknowledge. And actually later on, I met up with one of them in Korea years later. I called her up. I said, oh, hey, I'd like to see you in Korea. And we were speaking Korean over dinner, and she just couldn't get over that. And that was also really like, I don't know, disappointing, I think, because I'd worked really hard. And for me, I felt more full. I was finally filling out these dark spots of my identity, or empty spaces previously before, or unexplored spaces. And all she could see was that same 16-year-old girl who was fake Korean, I guess. So yeah, I don't know if my appearance had a big part to play in that at that time. As I've grown older, most definitely. Some culture shocks I experienced when I came to Korea. I don't think I even thought of myself in the space of cultures or this side and that side. I was really just, how I thought was how I thought, regardless of other factors. Maybe I like to think that, because obviously I would have been influenced by my upbringing and those who are around me. But instead of, for example, if something happened where I would think, oh, that's just how it's done in Korea. This is Korean culture, Becky. You got to understand it. Instead, it was more like, oh, well, the situation that happened to me today with that person, well, I got to figure this out. Oh, I guess this is just how that person thinks. I think more than culture shocks, because everything for me is just kind of rolled off like water off of an oily surface. It's just like, oh, well, that's just what happens here. But there are things that stand out to me, and that would be the injustices that I witnessed along the way and how those affected me. For example, the school that I was in, my first day of arrival, and the 원장님 pitting me against the English-speaking teachers so that she could control me as somebody who spoke English but looked Korean enough. And so she purposely would separate us. And it's only in retrospect I would realize, whoa, she was manipulating me to benefit her and to keep the English-speaking teachers down. This was one thing I recognized. And then her firing me before the contract was up on grounds that, of course, were not contractually legal. But me, not knowing this, just let it go. And then I would really grapple with that later and think, why didn't I take this up? Why didn't I read the contract better? Why didn't I go to the court? Because I would have won. And then I thought there's just so many people who don't know who are taking advantage just like that. But it's later when I look back at it and realize that probably, the uppers saw a big advantage. I spoke English, I spoke Korean decently well, I looked the way that I do, I was capable of interacting with people all over the world, and they wanted to take advantage of that. But in order to, I suppose, control that, I had to feel like their pawn were powerless so that they could use it to their own whim. I do believe in Korea it has to do with because I didn't speak Korean fluently. I really think this is a significant factor. And also because I looked very Korean, but I also didn't look very Korean. And so I existed in this sort of middle space where they wouldn't embrace me as their own, but I also wasn't an alien who had their own people to be embraced by. So I had no one to fall back on, I think, and be protected by. So I think a lot of this has influenced why I began the Halfie Project ultimately. Yeah. So throughout this whole journey, as I've been here, we like to use the terms of discovering identity, discovering myself, establishing my identity, self-discovery, and all of those things are very true. But I believe that in order to really come to terms with who you are, because you're not a single being. I am not just an atom floating around in the space. I have connections. I have people to rely on, and I think it's taken me a long time to figure out I don't exist as a single being, but I am the result of generations, of so much history, of so much culture, of so many people. When you feel like you're not embraced by any of those people, you sometimes want to just shed it away. I had to come to terms with that. And that, for me, is more of this defining of identity. Learning looking into your history, looking into your culture, looking into your background, asking your parents, trying to find out those things that all together make up who you are. That to me is more discovery of identity, which can be really incredibly painful, especially, I think, for people who exist in that middle space. And so the Halfie Project for me was a way to see if I could assuage the wild beast, I guess, or try to find a way to come to terms with this inner struggle. And so I just threw the questions out there using the YouTube channel and my limited connections. And it's crazy because people were answering back and saying, I have that same question. And that has to do with just our global society today and the use of social media and all of that. And the more that I was asking, the more I realized how much trauma many half Koreans have faced. And it doesn't always have to be violent, abusive trauma like the first generations after the war. I also think that there are quiet, mundane, daily traumas that a lot of mixed kids have faced. Not just mixed kids too, but adoptees. And because you internalize it and you start to kind of give a reason for why you feel this miserable, you excuse yourself and think like, well, it's just me. And then you stop asking because it's just too hard. So having someone like myself who was, I think, somewhat of a juggernaut, as in I just wanted to break the walls down because I was so tired of feeling this way, allowed a space for those people who felt that way to speak. And by speaking and asking and exploring and then being validated in feeling that way, it gives you more strength to continue on, to keep asking, to keep seeking, to keep figuring out, and therefore learning more about yourself and establishing a sense of identity. So I imagine for a lot of mixed kids that's really, really significant because I didn't have anyone to ask. And I believe there's just been so much wrong, so much disbalance in the Korean society, everywhere. In American Korean societies, here in Korea, other parts of the world, among the Korean diaspora, and especially with mixed kids, because of this struggle with identity and trying to find their place. A lot of those things that happened to me have led me to where I am today. My name is Becky White, and this is my Korean American story.